So I think one of the most interesting things I've heard you talk about, and you really touched on it in your video about Basil, is suspension. And I think more specifically, the conversation about how much you change your suspension between race mode and travel mode, how much your spring rates go up. And for most people, when they get an adventure bike, it's not something they think a lot about. They just put more weight on a stock bike. So for you, what should their priorities be if they're changing the suspension on their bike or they're building a travel bike?
Yeah, suspension is a difficult one. It's a difficult one to get right, but I'll share some principles that I used when building my bikes, and I would still use the same principles if I had a production bike today. The biggest mistake people make is that what you said. They don't do anything with the suspension. They literally just bolt everything onto it and go riding. The springs are very soft in production bikes typically because they're built for comfort on the road. And when you get off-road with soft springs and heavy bikes and soft valving, it's a recipe for disaster. The forks are bottoming out, the rear shock's bottoming out. You know, you guys that follow a lot of forums and stuff, you'll see frames breaking, rear trailing arms breaking on the GSs, 690s snapping the yokes off the frames. I can almost guarantee you that is nearly always suspension that's caused that. A lack of suspension, heavy hit, suspension bottoms out, the load can go nowhere but through the components. And that's when stuff starts going wrong. My bike is essentially the frame on the 690 Rally is very similar to the 690 Enduro. It's done 234,000 kilometers. I've never seen or experienced a crack in it or anything. It's got really good suspension in the bike and it very rarely bottoms out. So I think one important thing to do is make sure that you've got your spring rate set right. That's something that's easy to do. Valving's a little bit different, but if you just get your spring rate right and your sag, then you'll be a lot closer to where you want to be than doing nothing. So there comes another challenge because a lot of people use their bike for two things. So they trail ride it on a weekend with their mates and then they put luggage on it and they go traveling. And they don't want to take the shock out and change the spring. And that's the same issue I had where I was racing the bike and then the day after the race finished, I was putting 50 kilograms of luggage on it and carrying on. And with my trip, and I can't do that with the same spring, so I had to change the spring. You can compromise though, you don't have to, and what I would recommend is that they either fit an adjustable preload ring so that they can, and they've got to pick something. They'll never get the perfect solution, but they've got to pick a spring in the middle. Not good for one or good for the other. Just pick a spring in the middle and then it'll be slightly too stiff when you've not got the luggage, and it'll be slightly too soft when you haven't, but you can compensate with the preload.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I would recommend is getting the spring rate right for what you're doing. And if you are doing both and it's a 50-50, make a compromise. Get something that's in between and then just adjust your sag to get the geometry of the bike right and you'll be good to go.
Cool. I suppose in that same point, you kind of have the conversation about weight as well, of not carrying too much, because the less you carry, the less you need to kind of up your spring rate.
Yeah. And also the more weight you put on it and the more load you put through the suspension, the more likely you are